As we have seen, Heidegger gives an existential analysis of the mind-world relationship and puts his concept of Dasein and his concept of the ontological difference at center stage. And in that sense, he breaks with the philosophical tradition and analyzes the relationship between mind and world from a phenomenological interpretation of the way the human being interacts in everyday life with its surrounding world. But in doing so, he also presents, as we have seen, a rather destabilizing and contingency-ridden understanding of Dasein. Because he complicates, or he somehow shows the way what is ontic so close to us is, with regard to an ontological analysis, very complicated or full of rich phenomena we are in everyday life not even conscious of and not familiar with. But let us go straight to paragraph 12, which is, I think, easy to understand. At the beginning of this paragraph, Heidegger again repeats his principal idea, for he says that Dasein's being in the world cannot be understood as a clearly definable determination of a location. We human beings are not in the same way in the world as, for example, a table is in the dining room. If we use the word in with regard to this kind of determination of location in space and time with regard to Dasein's being in the world, we fall prey to a category mistake. That's why Heidegger writes, by this in we mean, in with regard to the table is in the dining room, the relationship of being which two entities extended in space have to each other with regard to their location in that space. Both water and glass, garment and cupboard are in space and at the location and both in the same way. End of quote. Things that appear within the world are so-called middle-sized objects, not Heidegger's terminology, compared to abstract objects, for example, like numbers, or physical objects like atoms. Heidegger calls the determination of such things in relation to a space categorical. Against this categorical being within, he posits an existential understanding of being with. And he tries to explain this with the help of an etymological interpretation where the word in is derived from the German word an, meaning to be close by, and who knows if this is correct. I quote Heidegger, an signifies I'm accustomed, I'm familiar with, I look after something. The entity to which being in this signification belongs is one which we have characterized as that entity which in each case I myself am. The expression bin is connected with by, and so ich bin means in its turn I reside or dwell alongside the world as that which is familiar to me in such and such a way, end of quote. We are not somehow in the world, but with it, at it, alongside of it, so we stick to the world. The difference appears to be trivial, but for Heidegger it is not, since phenomenologically speaking, this is exactly what the discipline of phenomenology focuses on, i.e. of how the world, or of how we dwell alongside the world within our existence. Any kind of subject-object relation misses this fact that we are along with the world and not in confrontation with the world, meaning along in a historically conditioned social fabric. This becomes explicitly interesting in his interpretation of the way we human beings use all kinds of tools, Zeug, in such a way that we misperceive these kind of tools as objects in front of us, while they are rather objects alongside of us. This is a topic of paragraph 15, and I will focus on this paragraph here briefly. Ancient Greek, so classical Greek, has a special term for these kinds of tools, Heidegger tells us. They are called pragmata, and as such, the word thing, also called pragmata, emphasizes that the most important property of a thing was its way of being a tool. Heidegger wants to revive precisely this pragmatic approach, and he does so by speaking of equipment, Zeug, instead of things. And he mentions explicitly writing equipment, Schreibzeug, sewing equipment, Nähzeug, working equipment, Arbeitszeug, etc., as examples and even talks about the fact that what makes equipment is its practicality. He writes, taken strictly, there is no such thing as in-equipment. To the being of any equipment, there always belongs a totality of equipment, in which it can be this equipment that it is. Equipment is essentially something in order to. A totality of equipment is constituted by various ways of the in order to, such as serviceability, conductiveness, usability, manipulability. In the in order to as a structure, there lies an assignment or reference of something to something. Pen, ink, paper, blotting pad, table, lamp, furniture, windows, doors, room. These things never show themselves proximally as they are for themselves, so as to add up to a sum of realia and fill up a room. End of quote. Heidegger expresses in this long quote his insight that human beings do not usually encounter entities as discrete visible objects, as substances present at hand. Heidegger demonstrates rather that our primary interaction with beings comes through using them. In our everyday life, objects are tools taken for granted, a vast environmental background supporting the thin and volatile layer of our explicit activities. Only rarely do we come to notice any of these subterranean elements of our lives. They emerge constantly from multiple layers of practical backgrounds and then sink back, figuratively speaking, when our focus of intentionality and our practices leave them alone or leave them aside. I do not have to think about the doorknob when I open the door. The doorknob emerges out of multiplicities of things automatically when I confront the door. The doorknob gives itself as something that, metaphorically speaking, awaits to be taken by my hand. I'm not thinking about this. I'm not problematizing it. The self-evident way of dealing with Zeug, of dealing with equipment, results from the self-evidence of an entire world of meaning where I participate almost blindly. The individual equipment is always already part of a totality of equipment. That's what Heidegger says. It is as such ready at hand. Heidegger explains this by using the example of a hammer, one of his most important examples. I quote Heidegger, "The hammering itself uncovers the specific handiness, Handlichkeit of the hammer, the kind of being which equipment possesses, in which it manifests itself in its own right, we call readiness to hand, zur Handenheit." End of quote. Now, irritation occurs when equipment suddenly does not work and its readiness at hand is withdrawn. The texture of the contact is interrupted and a certain irritation then is revealed. But this is rather secondary, because we are always already moving in a semantic texture of abstract and practical meanings, where I usually know where the door handle is, or how difficult it is usually to push it down, or how high the step height of a staircase is, etc. One can also say in this sense that the cup that I lift to my lips to drink from is presenting itself as a potential being part of me. I don't see the cup as a cup at all. I deal with it as part of an action sequence. In this sense, it is part of a practice in which I float often unconsciously. In that sense, I don't have to think about the cup being a cup. It presents itself as something that fits in very nicely my lips when I take a sip from the coffee cup. A good example of the same phenomena is perhaps the act of parking a car. I think we have all experienced this. The limits of the car suddenly seem like the limits of our body, and in the act of parking, our consciousness automatically establishes a kind of protective shield beyond the boundaries of the car. Even if I cannot see my own bumper or the bumper of my own car, I nevertheless develop a feeling for it just before I hit the other car. In this situation, our consciousness performs a special form of being in the world, a form like being in the world by sitting in a car and parking it. Our consciousness does this automatically, just as the blind person uses its cane not just as a medium, but transforms the cane into its own hand or her own hand. When I run over a wooden surface with my finger, like over the wooden surface of the speaker's desk, I feel the wooden surface and I don't feel my finger. And similar, the blind person, when the blind person touches with a cane the street he or she perceives the surface of the street and not the cane. Perhaps you know the film Being John Malkovich. It describes life on a secret floor in a building where all everyday dimensions have shrunk to midget size. People have to walk through the rooms bent over and are always facing each other, also bent over. We find this funny because it only shows how anthropocentric our everyday world is, where we usually know without thinking that we won't bang our foreheads when we get out of an elevator. But Heidegger's point is not just to say that things are ready at hand before I perceive them categorically. His interest is also about the observation that things present themselves to me or offer themselves to me. That means the objects that surround our bodies also reflect the possible actions that we can perform with them. As I already mentioned, the cup in front of me, the teacup, for example, offers me the option of an action. In this sense, one could almost say that the cup reveals itself as something to which I'm intentionally inclined. But intentionality is not exclusively located in my mind. The outside world, for example, the cup in its being a cup, reveals how intentionality is almost a reciprocal back and forth between me and the world, in this case, between me and the cup. Please allow me a critical side note. When Heidegger analyzes Dasein phenomenologically, his argument starts always with a psychologically healthy person. He is not interested in what Freud or Lacan will be interested in. That means how such a healthy psyche can take the hammer in its readiness at hand, comes to its ego function in the first place. People suffering from psychopathologies show that the unconscious everydayness of our being concerned or being acting, being working, is not at all problem-free, but the result of a painful process of the individual's mind development. And I think that René Magritte shows in his paintings how reality can present different features of our mind when it has lost contact with the ready-at-hand relation to the outside world that for Heidegger is something that somehow every Dasein is familiar to. Jacques Lacan will reveal that being in the world, which for Heidegger is so self-evident and harmless, is based on a rather complex and partly traumatic developmental process, which begins, among others, with the fact that the infant must separate itself from the mother's breasts so that a world of objects can gradually be built up around a fundamental lost object. When, in early childhood stages, serious problems arise between the infant and the medium that conveys the outside world to it as stable and equipped with readable semantics, and these are, in general, of course, the parents, then unexpected relations to the world are revealed, relations that remind us of the most terrible paintings of Hieronymus Bosch, and which we are reminded of in our dreams. I just mentioned this because Heidegger presupposes in his analysis of Dasein what Freud calls the ego function and gives little importance to developmental stages of the mind so that he can start with the ego function. Paragraph 13. In this paragraph, Heidegger develops the rudiments of an epistemology, which he will elaborate further in paragraph 44. What's important with regard to this paragraph? Well, first of all, Heidegger says that traditional epistemology starts out quite classically from a relation between subject and object. He further claims that in the so-called theory, I quote, there lurks as much truth as vacuity, end of quote. Subject and object do not coincide with Dasein and the world. So we can see from these quotes, from these sentences of Heidegger, that Heidegger turns against the tradition of the so-called Adequatio-Theorie. According to this theory, cognition is understood as a mind-dependent activity that guarantees that our judgments about facts in the world truly relate to state of affairs in the world. Remember how John Locke described this relation? I mentioned this in the first lecture. The mind reconstructs the material of the outside world as transmitted by the five senses with the help of the intellect and perceives what is out there in some kind of Cartesian theater. The problem of this adequatio or correspondence theory of perception, though it's not the same, and knowledge is that a subject-object relation is presupposed which does not take account of the fact that Dasein dwells alongside its world. The argument we have already, an argument that we have already heard. Locke shows how the object is interpreted as representation, and obviously this is something that Heidegger is criticizing in his own somehow phenomenological kind of epistemology. Heidegger writes, of course, we are sometimes assured that we are certainly not to think of the subject's inside and its inner sphere as a sort of box or cabinet. But when one asks for the positive signification of their inside of immanence, then silence reigns. End of quote. And he continues, we must keep in mind that knowing is grounded beforehand in being ready alongside the world, which is essentially constitutive for Dasein's being. Proximally, this being already alongside is not just a fixed starting, it's something that is purely present at hand. And further, another quote, if knowing is to be possible, then there must be first a deficiency in our having to do with the world concernfully, end of quote. Heidegger says here that the epistemological question appears only if concern as a mode of being in is intentionally ignored. So in that sense he says, well, the classical epistemological questions are already too abstract and they miss Dasein's being surrounded in an ontic life relation is not taken into account. It follows that this kind of being towards the world is one which lets us encounter entities within the world purely in the way they look, just that. On the basis of this kind of being and as a mode of it, looking explicitly at what we encounter is possible. Looking at something in this way is sometimes a definite way of taking up a direction towards something, setting our sights toward what is present at hand. It takes over a viewpoint in advance from the entity which it encounters. Such looking at enters the mode of dwelling autonomously alongside entity within the world, end of quote. Why Heidegger's stress on this as a mode, or his focus on the viewpoint that we always take when we access the world? My interpretation here is that for Heidegger, the theoretical analysis of knowledge is one mode among the many, for example, Kant's mode of analysis or Hegel's mode or whatever. And this mode is based on the suppression of all other modes, obviously. Blanking out or suppressing other modes does not remain, though, a neutral event. The mode in which I relate to the outside world actually changes the same outside world ontologically, changes its fundamental structure. This has a little bit to do with what I was explaining to you with regard to the Matrix movie. Dasein is so intertwined with the world in its historical fabric that any access to this world does not leave it neutral. I admit this sounds a little bit like New Age spiritism. But Heidegger thinks a little bit in this direction. In his later criticism of modern technology, for example, a letter on humanism, Heidegger will explain that the way technology regulates our everyday life is shaped by a certain aspect of our relationship to the world, an aspect which we no longer control because it has already pre-structured our perception in advance, so to speak, so that we are somehow blinded by a tradition we do not even as something that has an impact on us, because we are living in this tradition. We are examples of this tradition. This means that if a certain outlook on the world takes a viewpoint toward states of affairs, as Heidegger says, then this also means that the entities that we encounter are oriented exactly with regard to this viewpoint. It follows that the entities we encounter in the reality surrounding us are determined by modes of knowledge, but modes of knowledge whose pre-reflexive impact on states of affairs can remain blind to us. So we are stuck in a supposedly neutral subject-object determination without knowing how a certain knowledge structure, transmitted to us through time and history, has already left an imprint on facts. Heidegger's text, The Age of the World picture, deals with a similar issue. There he asserts that following the paradigm of Descartes' philosophy, modernity, so 16th, 17th century modernity, has placed its relationship to the world under the viewpoint of the natural sciences. Heidegger does not want to develop a new theory of truth, like a theory of realism or anti-realism or constructivism, or a new theory of meaning. He wants to describe truth as a phenomenon. So truth is not a question of how propositions relate to facts in the world, since truth is an existential experience, and as such, as phenomenon, is of a deeper level as analytic philosophers like Gottfried Frege think when they focus on truth value analysis and propositions. The phenomenon of truth lies deeper than the classical location of truth in theories of judgment. The adequatio or correspondent theory of truth attributed to Aristotle, among others, describes the place of truth in judgment, and then here truth is understood as the convergence of understanding with the judged facts, and this just means adequatio rei et intellectuis, or ad intellectuis. Take an example. A person A expresses the fact P, some state of affair in the world, and as such a fact that can be either true or false. If knowledge is constituted, then the sentence is true, because then I know that a certain fact in the state, in the world out there is true. Heidegger, however, wants to say that this understanding of truth is derived from a more original experience of truth in which Dasein is time and again caught up in processes of discovering new layers of reality and new layers of meaning. Dasein als Entdeckendsein, that's how Franco Volpi describes the concept of truth. In the essay on the essence of truth, Heidegger writes, "To reveal being as such is in itself at the same time to conceal being as a whole. And the simultaneity of revealing and concealing error prevails. To conceal what is hidden and to err both belong to what the essence of truth is about." So truth for Heidegger is thus something like a paradoxical intertwinement of layers of reality where presence and withdrawal of being takes place. To reduce truth to the correspondence of a judgment to a fact in the world is derived from this experience of presence and withdrawal. And this is what the Greek word aletheia is about, which means literally unveiling or revealing. In this initial sense, true, the word true would be what is or what reveals itself, steps forward into the light of our attention, and presents itself in an openness or in what Heidegger calls disclosure. And I think the philosopher Borch Jakobsen expresses this fittingly with the following words. Before any conception of truth in terms of the straightness of the gaze or the correctness of the statement, truth is pure presentation of itself for a gaze or a viewpoint, and i.e. at the same time pure withdrawal from our perspective. End of quote. To see, or as Heidegger says, to be discovering, which is not the same as to discover, means that while something can come to the fore, something is withdrawn into the background. I can never see all 6 sides of a cube, for example, and in a similar way, truth always points to a dimensionality which at the same time of its encounter also hides something else. This line of argument, which is, I admit, very general, may help to understand Heidegger's famous and polemical dictum when he says, technology does not think. Technology does not have to think, in a way. Its greatest achievement lies in suppressing multiplicity of reality's dimension, for example, the ontic ontological difference, or the integration of human beings in non-purpose relationships with its environment. But Heidegger does not criticize this naively. He says, well, science doesn't have to think philosophically. That's why that's its purpose. And he means this somehow seriously. Physicians and technicians don't have to think philosophically. This is not their purpose. Their purpose is, in that sense, not to think. Their work must be focused on a scientific field of research where phenomenological investigations are of no concern. And somehow this is good. A laboratory is a place of abstraction and specialization, and this is its purpose. But again, this is why Heidegger can say, technology does not think. Thanks for your attention.